We need each other. We need to be networking together and supporting one another, because every one of us has our downer moments when we feel we have no hope. But if we have our brothers around us to encourage us and to build us up and say, you have a lot of hope. You have a lot of people who love you and care for you. And we're some of them right here. That's what makes a huge difference. O heavenly King, Comforter, Spirit of truth, who art everywhere present and fillest all things, treasury of blessings and giver of life, come and abide in us and cleanse us from every impurity and save our souls, O good one.
Amen. Thank you, Abbot. As I was researching your biography, I came across the interview in Orthodox Christian, Ortho Christian. I don't know how old that interview is, but I read through that. And what I noticed is the basically abandonment of the Lutheranism you were raised, and then a journey into Trotskyite ideology, into psychology, and you ended up in the Orthodox Church. Now, that seems to be a pattern that fits a lot of men, and and it's different in generations, it's different between different groups, but the pattern is basically this. There's always a period of the abandonment of the old. I noticed this first one, back a decade or so ago, a little more, when the big atheist thing, Christopher Hitchens, you had all the celebrity atheists and all that, and you had a lot of young guys following him. I watched that closely because I ended up debating one of those guys at the University of Maryland about 15 years ago. And it alarmed me, right? But then I started listening to them, and I realized that a lot of them came from fundamentalist families. And so I thought, why is it that those who were raised in the fundamentalism abandoned it and embraced atheism? And I realized that this is basically, it functions as kind of a detoxification of sorts. They have to reject it. And I think that rejection is almost necessary in order to open oneself up for orthodoxy. Because the doctrines, especially of fundamentalism and Calvinism, they're really pernicious. And they portray not the God of Abraham, but a strange and foreign God, ultimately. So I think that's the path of many American converts into the Orthodox Church. It's my reading of it anyway. And that detoxification is of particular interest to me. And I'm wondering if you might have anything to say about that.
Well, first of all, I would say that when I look back at my Lutheranism, recently I Googled First Lutheran Church of Sandpoint, Idaho, because that's where I grew up. The church there was built when I was in high school, their new church. And my mother was the church organist. My dad was the golf pro in Sandpoint. And my mom and dad both moved to Coeur d'Alene. And glory to God, they both converted to Orthodoxy. And I read recently where the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America has lost over 5 million members. And so I was curious, and I grew up, I was born and raised in Spokane. We moved to Sandpoint when I was in the 7th grade, going into the 7th grade. So I Googled this morning, Lutheran churches in Spokane. And I also again Googled First Lutheran Church in Sandpoint. And I was shocked to see that the majority of the people, I would say probably probably 85% or more of the people that go to those churches are white-haired people. Now, I don't have anything against white-haired people since I am one. But there's no young people. And by comparison, here at the monastery on a given Sunday, we have a myriad of young men who come from all over to attend the liturgy and who stay for the meal and for the class that one of our monks teaches in Orthodoxy. And of course, I don't have to tell any of you that the Orthodox Church is seeing a huge surge of young men, especially, coming into the Orthodox Church. And I look back at my own journey, and when I was toward the end of my sophomore year in college is when I decided that my Lutheranism was no longer relevant to me. When I first went to college, I was the president of the Lutheran Student Association, both in my freshman and sophomore years. But toward the end of my sophomore year, I decided that I didn't even want to be Lutheran. I didn't want to be anything that had anything to do with Christianity. And so I walked away from Christianity. And I essentially became an atheist. I didn't declare myself an atheist, but as I look back at that period of time, I was definitely an atheist. And I eventually went to UC Berkeley for graduate school, and that solidified my atheism, of course. And it also, as I was studying to be a psychologist, I found myself at UC Berkeley being radicalized politically. I was one of those people that was taking part in rather violent demonstrations on the UC Berkeley campus. And I was very anti-police, anti-military, anti-American, really. I became a Marxist, a Trotskyite, to be more exact. And I was in that journey for quite a while, and I moved to Portland to teach in a small college, and I also was going to be a therapist in a clinic there. And so when I arrived in Portland, which at the time was a very liberal city, it's even more so now. And when I arrived in Portland, I took all that garbage that I had in Berkeley, and I basically spread it around in Portland. A number of years ago, I was in Portland, and there was a big demonstration taking place in front of the federal building. And I remember I drove to Portland to meet with a couple of priest friends of mine. And that late afternoon, I decided to drive into downtown to see what was going on with this radicalized demonstrations going on in front of the federal building. So I drove around the federal building, and on the back side, which was the side by the river, I saw a man on the other side of a chain link fence. And I pulled up, and I asked him if he was a federal agent. And he kind of looked at me, and he didn't answer. So as I continued driving, I drove around a second time, and I was thinking, gee, this man, when he heard me ask that question, probably figured that I was part of the group out front. I had long hair and a beard and dressed funny, and that's all he saw. So when I drove around the second time, by then he was on the side where the demonstrators were. He was still behind the chain link fence, but across the street were two parks, 3 parks actually. And that was where there was an encampment of these radicals. And so this time I pulled up right next to the fence, again. And this time I pulled out my sheriff's badge that said chaplain on it. And I held it up to him and I said, I just want you to know that I am a sheriff's chaplain. I've been the chaplain for the sheriff's department in King County, Washington for many years. And I said, I had to do this because, and I said, I want to say this as words of encouragement, that at one time I was one of the people that led demonstrations in front of this very building of radicals in Portland when I was demonstrating against the system. And I said, I did that so often that I felt that the only way I could redeem myself was to become a chaplain to law enforcement, which I did. 18 years I was a chaplain to law enforcement. And the man, and as I held up this badge, and the man gave me this really big, beaming smile. And just as he did that, I'm thinking, all these radicals across the street have just seen this long-haired, bearded guy holding up something. And the man on the other side of the chain-link fence, their enemy, is smiling. So I took that as my cue to get the heck out of Portland. So I left. But I think that journey that I had that ultimately led me into Orthodoxy was the very same journey that a lot of young people have today. That there's nothing in our society that fills the void that is there. And that which masquerades itself as Christianity is not really Christian. The very first time that I knew the truth of that was when I had taken a leave of absence, it's a sabbatical, for 8 months because I had been at a cocktail, a faculty a cocktail party in the summertime at the college where I was teaching. And I was talking to two men in another department. And one of them said, I am so bored. I haven't had a student that's inspired me in years. I've still got 3 years until I retire. I don't know how I'm going to deal with it. And the other guy said, oh, do what I do. I make a game of it. I set out to destroy every belief system that my students come to class with. And the other guy said, what a great idea. I'm going to do it. And I took my cocktail and I walked away and I went up to a friend of mine in my department and I told him what I had just heard. And Jerry said, well, I hate to tell you this, but probably the majority of the faculty on this campus feel the same way. And I thought, you know, the longer I'm here, the more likely I'm going to become like them. And I don't want to be like that. And that's when I applied for a sabbatical, and it turned out that someone in my department had applied and pulled back at the last minute, so the following year was open for me to take a sabbatical, and I took it. And toward the end of my sabbatical, when I still didn't know what I was going to do, I was spending most of my time living out of a VW bus that had peace signs and flowers painted on it. And I was incognito. And I bought it from a hippie in Portland. And I went there incognito to Big Sur, essentially, where I was living for that period of time out of that van. And I drove into San Francisco. And for the very first time, I attended the Divine Liturgy at an Orthodox Church. It was Holy Virgin Joy of All Who Sorrow Cathedral. And the late Archbishop Anthony was serving. And I remember standing in the cathedral. Mind you, I'm an atheist and still a Marxist. And the two rows of priests, vested priests, were facing each other with the archbishop on a beam. And one of them came up and took a blessing, and he went through the deacon's door. And a moment later, the deacon's door, the veil opens and the deacon's door is opened. And for the first time, I saw the Holy of Holies. And that was like at that moment that I knew that the question that I had had to my Lutheran pastor when I was a 10-year-old, and we had just finished studying the Old Testament temple and how God designed this temple and all the vestments that the priests would wear and what they would do in that temple. And I remember asking the pastor, why did God care so much about how he was worshipped in the Old Testament, but he doesn't seem to care now? And the pastor said, well, they were under the old covenant, we're under the new. And I remember as a 10-year-old thinking, what a lame answer. And at that moment, as this troubled psychologist who's an atheist, I'm beholding the Holy of Holies. And then it struck me that the layout of this cathedral is the same layout as the temple that God designed. And here I am. And this is the most beautiful thing about Orthodoxy. It's not something that a local minister invents. It's something that all of us behold and embrace. And it's something that fills that void that we all have when we're separated from the church. And so I have never been happier. I'm a happy old guy. I'm 80 years old, but I'm happy. I'm happy to be Orthodox.
That's a beautiful story, Abbot. That's a beautiful story. What was, okay, when you look back on going into Joy of All Who Sorrows, I mean, it had to have been God to bring you that church in particular. It had to have been, right? But you saw the holiest of holies. I don't usually speak this way, but did the Lord come to you? You saw something. Something really happened because you were converted.
On the spot.
Yeah.
It was one of those hallelujah moments.
Yeah. So leading up to that, there's always preparation, right? And that preparation usually involves some suffering. It does. It's the only way our hearts are softened, especially when we come out of a rigidly ideological background, whether it's political or religious. Describe to us some of your suffering.
Well, I can tell you one of the things that happened during my days in Berkeley. When I moved to Portland to take over, to be teaching psychology, and I remember one time I was in a coffee house in downtown Portland with a bunch of friends. And one of my friends said, you know, a lot of us are afraid of being out publicly with you because you have such a volatile temper. And I was sort of shocked to hear that. And he said, I for one am afraid that someday I'm going to be witnessing somebody gunning us all down, or you're going to cause all of us to get arrested because you have such a temper. You're so angry all the time. And I wasn't aware of how angry I was. But as I look back looked back at it years later, after my conversion to Christ, I realized that I had nothing. I thought that if I became a psychologist and I was teaching psychology in a college, that would be fulfilling for me, and that I would feel enriched by that, and that I would feel proud that, oh, I'm not just anybody, I'm a psychologist. But it was like the opposite had happened. I felt like an absolute, utter failure because I wasn't happy. I wasn't happy. When I was teaching, a lot of my colleagues, I was very strange as far as the faculty. Every day I would take a 3-hour lunch break and I'd spend an hour and a half running in a local, on a bunch of local trails in a county forest. And on Friday evenings, I would get in my car and I would drive to Cannon Beach, Oregon, I had a little cabin in Cannon Beach. And I would stop in the town and I'd buy a steak and a bottle of wine and I'd go to this little cabin of mine and the first thing I would do is I'd go running on the beach for an hour. And then I'd come back and I'd do my steak and drink my bottle of wine, and I'd read British novels. I didn't want anything to do with psychology, so I read British novels. And it was the summertime. I would walk over on this path to the beach, and I'd sit on the beach and I'd read British novels. And then I'd go back Sunday evening to Portland. But I remember thinking about how about my life in Portland was so fixated on just my job, but I wasn't happy. I didn't really feel fulfilled. And I felt I should be fulfilled. I mean, I've got, this great job and my degrees and blah, 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 but I wasn't happy. But at that moment in Holy Virgin Cathedral, I felt when those royal doors were opened that I saw Christianity for the very first time. And I embraced it. And glory to God in His divine providence, He had 3 monks that were visiting the cathedral for that service. They weren't part of the cathedral, but they were visiting it for the liturgy. And they were standing talking to people in the narthex. So I walked out and I waited till they were done, and I went up and I said, could I ask you some questions about Orthodoxy? So they ended up inviting me to their monastery for Vespers that evening. And I would usually spend 1 or 2 nights in Berkeley with old friends when I would drive up from the California coast. And so this time I decided that I was going to stay a week, and so every night I went to this monastery for Vespers and to talk with all of them. And by the time that was over with and I drove back to Big Sur, I wrote 2 letters of resignation, one to the clinic and one to the college. I didn't tell them what I was going to do, but I separated myself. Years later, after I was a monk, And we'd moved our monastery from the Bay Area to Vashon Island. And I was driving up the coast from San Francisco from a meeting with my Archbishop. And I stopped into the home of an elderly couple in Portland that I had rented a room from when I was out of college. And they were old friends, and I hadn't seen them in years. So I stopped in to see them. And when you can imagine their shock when they saw this long-haired, bearded weirdo dressed in a black robe standing at their door. And then when they found out who I was, they were even more shocked. And that weekend, my friend Nestor and Myra went to their Unitarian church. And Nestor told one of his friends at the Unitarian church that an old friend of theirs had come to see them. And he said he used to be a psychologist here in Portland, and the friend said, "Oh, what was his name?" And when they told him, it turned out that Jerry was one of my colleagues at the college, and he and I were at the same clinic. And he didn't get tenure at the college because he didn't fit their image of what a professor should look like. But he and I were best friends. And so Jerry asked Nestor to ask me to come to see them for dinner the next time I was in Portland. So I called up Jerry, and that following week I drove back to Portland, and I had dinner with Jerry and Judy. And during dinner, Jerry said, "You were such a respected psychologist, and we knew you weren't in the field anymore because you didn't ask for references. And so we were all saddened that you had walked away from this profession." And I said, "Well, actually, I didn't walk away, because the Orthodox Church sees herself as the hospital for the soul, and her priests are the therapists." And then when I got back to my island, I sent him as a gift the book by Hierotheos Vlachos, Orthodox Psychotherapy. And a few weeks later, Jerry called me, and he said, "That's one of the heaviest books I've ever read. I had to read it twice." And he said, "You are a therapist. In fact, you're a better therapist now than you were then." And that's the thing, the rich, beautiful thing about our orthodoxy, is that it is the psychotherapy that everyone needs. And the priests are the therapists. And of course, like the secular therapists who are in need of therapy themselves, we priests certainly need therapy. Now, I need a lot of therapy. But this is the church, this is the Orthodox Church that just fills us with that which is missing. And I am just ever so grateful to God to revealing the Orthodox Church to me. I cannot fathom that moment in time when I felt drawn to attend an Orthodox liturgy at Holy Virgin Cathedral, because I didn't go there because I wanted to attend a service. I went there out of curiosity. But I look back, and it wasn't curiosity that drew me to the cathedral. It was God. God brought me there.
You know, there's a lot of...
By the way, just so you know, this is water. It's not vodka.
Okay. That's good. There's a lot of themes that I think the guys who are listening to you are relating to. And estrangement, loneliness, even though you had a good appointment, lack of direction, lack of vocation, really. And And I know a lot of guys struggle with that. And coming out of the darkness into the light, it's a tremendously trying experience for most men. What kind of encouragement can you give them? What about the guys? They come to Christ and they're in the church, and I'm sure you deal with a lot of young men. They still feel broken. They still feel broken. What do you tell them?
Well, first of all, I would say this. Years ago, I would go to St. Nicholas Ranch in Dunlap, California, for their young adult retreats. And I would be there speaking to the young men, and there was a nun that would speak to the young women. Mother Markella, who's the abbess of that incredible monastic community of women, and I are very close. And in fact, many years ago, she announced to her nuns that she hadn't heard from her brother in Greece in over 20 years. And she says, I'm adopting Father Tryphon as my brother. And so I let them all know that as a gentleman, I would never ask a woman her age. So I assumed that I am older than her in age, but younger than her in monasticism. So I referred to myself to the nuns as I am Mother Markella's older, younger brother. And all the young nuns there, and there's about 40 of them, consider me their uncle. Okay. So when I was there, I noticed something about the young men that were there. Lots of young men that were coming there once a year for this thing. And one of the problems that we have in our society is that we have demonized young men. If they're white, even more so. We've made them white privileged. And I don't know any of them that feel privileged, but we call them white privileged. And so I look at all these young men, and even on the university side of things, they're sort of sidelined. The university is more for minorities and for women, not for young men who are white. And so a lot of young men feel like they have nothing, and they're not going anywhere in their life. And so when I was there in Dunlap, it hit me that what they really need is to journey together. Not alone, but together. Because it's in our unity. And I know you guys see that in this brotherhood that you have established. But it's in our unity as brothers that we grow. So I established the Salish Brotherhood of St. John the Wonder Worker. We have over 80-some young people that are part of it. Not all of them participate, but every year here at the monastery we have an average of 20 young men that come in the summertime and 20 young men that come in the wintertime. The summertime they camp out in our forests, and in the wintertime in our various buildings. And I basically let them be. I don't lord over them. I am here making sure they're getting the food and attending the services and knowing that I love them. But mostly I'm witnessing them interacting with one another and networking. And the whole purpose of that Salish Brotherhood was I wanted to see a network of men into old age. That's what young men need. That's what old men need. We need each other. We need to be networking together and supporting one another. Because every one of us has our downer moments when we feel we have no hope. But if we have our brothers around us to encourage us and to build us up and say, you have a lot of hope. You have a lot of people who love you and care for you. And we're some of them right here. That's what makes a huge difference. I think that's one of the things that I've learned the importance of by being a monastic. We have 6 monastics in our community, and we have 2 others that are postulants. And I can't tell you the joy that I feel as an 80-year-old man being surrounded by these young men who love each other, who support each other, who build each other up. And that's what our networking in brotherhoods is all about, as you know.
Yeah.
That we support each other, that we build each other up, because not one of us in a situation like that is alone. And our orthodoxy is not about me, it's about us collectively.
You know, you mentioned earlier, this will be the last question, and then we'll open it up because I think the guys will probably have a few questions for you. But you mentioned earlier, you know, the healing, and that you're still a therapist, but you're God's therapist. And what we've discovered here in the brotherhood is that when a brother loves a brother, that opens up the channels, so to speak, for God's healing grace to flow. And a lot of the guys who had poor relationships with their fathers or no relationship with their father at all, they find that paternal healing in the connection and love with their brother, because brotherly love is always paternal. And so the church then becomes the family. I will give you mothers, fathers, brothers, and sisters, Christ says, if you follow me. And we see for a lot of these young men, it's the first real family connection they have, at least a healthy one. And so from a psychotherapeutic point of view, and this really interests me, I think about this a lot, that channel, that connection, that God's grace always heals. I'm sure you've seen that in your ministry over the years. If you could speak to that a little bit.
The most common term for me, you know, the Russian Orthodox Church doesn't, or American Orthodoxy, period, doesn't really have the intimate title for abbots that, say, the Greeks have. But with that in mind, when I had a young man call me grandpa for the first time, and I thought, bingo, that's it. And so I am grandpa. And I have a lot of my monks called me grandpa. And my spiritual children called me grandpa. And there's something about a grandfather that is different than a father. I saw this when I was, as a therapist, I could see it. That grandparents tend to be, because they've already raised children and been very strict with their children, but by the time they have grandchildren, they tend to be a lot more laid back and let their grandchildren have a lot more freedom. And I think that that's as a grandfather that I have with the young men that come to me. I am not a tyrannical elder. You will obey. But rather, I'm a grandpa that they know loves them. And in turn, I feel loved by them. And I love it when my monks call me grandpa, because it's so much more personal than abbot. All I ask is that I not be called Costello. I know that some of you younger ones have no idea what that means, but you older ones do.
Yeah, we do.
Men are in crisis. And men are in crisis because they don't know who they are or what they were created for. It affects their lives in big ways. You were not meant to struggle alone. Step out of the chaos. Discover the man that God created you to be. We challenge you. Join us. You will discover a life worth living. Join the Brotherhood.